Jason Statham appears. When a rude customer attacks a clerk with Down syndrome, blood dripped slowly between his fingers as Marco stared at the lifeless body before him. His ragged breathing formed small clouds in the chilly air of the apartment. He had never imagined he was capable of such a thing. The wall clock read 2:17 a.m., and the only sound was the relentless ticking mingled with the hum of the refrigerator. On the kitchen floor, Jason's cell phone still blinked with notifications. His last sent message remained unanswered. "We need to talk, now." Marcos, 34, a respected doctor at the municipal hospital, now knelt on the white-tiled floor, trying to process what had happened. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The kitchen knife lay a few centimeters away, stained with the blood of the man who had been his husband for 8 years, the man whom everyone called charming and attentive, the man who, exactly 40 minutes, Fago had confessed his most heinous crime. "You needed to know that it was always temporary," he had said with a disconcerting coldness, emptying his glass of whiskey. "Isabella was always my plan A." The doorbell rang shrill, pulling him out of his shock. For a moment, panic paralyzed him. Through the peephole, he recognized Sophia, his sister-in-law, Jason's sister, the only person in his family with whom he maintained genuine ties. What was she doing there at that hour? Had Jason called her earlier? Marcos looked at his blood-stained hands and the body on the floor. Time was up. He took a deep breath and opened the door just enough so that Sophia couldn't see the inside of the apartment. But his sister-in-law's gaze pierced him as if she could see beyond the walls. "You already know, don't you?" Sophia whispered, her eyes glistening, confirming Marcos's worst fear. "About Isabella. About what he did." It was at that moment that Marcos realized that night had only just begun. 3 months earlier, Marcos had watched Jason sleep beside him with a mix of love and distrust. After 8 years together, he knew every line of expression, every mark that life had left on that 38-year-old face. Jason was an architect, charismatic, with that kind of smile that won over clients and diffused criticism just as quickly. The kind of man everyone admired at social gatherings, but few truly knew. Their relationship had begun like a cliché. A newly graduated doctor meets an architect in a cafe during a hurried break. What wasn't cliché, however, was the baggage they both carried. Marcos came from a broken family. He grew up watching his father manipulate his mother with elaborate lies until she became just a shadow of herself. Perhaps that's why he developed an acute sensitivity to detecting falsehoods, and in recent months, his radar hadn't stopped beeping. Jason had changed. Small inconsistencies in his stories, hastily answered calls in other rooms, and a subtle distance growing between them. More disturbing was his sudden interest in the case of Isabella Mendonça, the 27-year-old teacher who had gone missing during a work trip 2 years ago. The case had shocked the city and still remained unsolved. "Why are you so obsessed with this story?" Marcos had asked one night, finding him absorbed in old news about the disappearance. "It's interesting from an architectural point of view," he had replied, quickly closing his laptop. "The hotel where she was last seen was a project by the studio that was my rival. I always imagined how the structure of the building might have contributed to what happened." The explanation sounded plausible. Jason had always been a critic of competing projects, but something in his tone had awakened that familiar sense of alert in Marcos. That same week, Marcos found in Jason's coat pocket a keychain with the letter I, which he dismissed as a client's giveaway. 2 weeks later, a receipt from a seaside restaurant 2 hours away from the city on a date when Jason was supposedly at a conference in São Paulo. The evidence of a possible betrayal was mounting. Sophia, Jason's younger sister, had become Marcos's confidant during these uncertain moments. The two developed an unlikely friendship. Sophia, a 32-year-old literature teacher, with her introverted and analytical nature, was the opposite of her brother's effusive charm. "You should confront him," Sophia had suggested during one of their weekly lunches. "Jason has always had this slippery side. Our parents never held him accountable for anything." "I'm afraid of what I might discover," Marcos had confessed, stirring his coffee with a spoon. "What if it's not just a betrayal?" Sophia hesitated, her gaze fixed on the cup. "What do you mean by that?" "I can't explain. Sometimes when he talks about the Isabella case, it seems too personal." The ensuing silence was as heavy as lead. The hardest part of the distrust was lying beside him every night, pretending nothing had changed, waiting for the moment when the truth would come out. Marcos had begun checking Jason's cell phone when possible, but he had become more cautious, always keeping it close. It was during a night shift at the hospital that Marcos received a phone call that would change everything. An anonymous voice, distorted by some app, whispered, "Look in the warehouse of the Mendonça construction. The answer about Isabella is there." Marcos recognized the name, Mendonça Construction, the company of Isabella's family, the missing woman, a company that, curiously, had already hired Jason for some smaller projects in the past. That very night, with his heart pounding and a flashlight in hand, Marcos used the spare key that Jason kept in his office. The warehouse was an old shed on the outskirts of the city, filled with construction materials and machinery. After nearly an hour of searching the place without finding anything relevant, he was about to give up when he noticed an area at the back, separated by a plastic tarp. Behind the makeshift partition, he found a table with architectural blueprints. He immediately recognized Jason's drawing style. They were designs for an isolated house in the mountainous region, signed with the pseudonym he used for personal projects. In the corner of one of the sheets, a note, "For Isabella and me, when it's all over." Marcos's world crumbled at that moment. It wasn't just a betrayal. Jason and Isabella had been having an affair, but where was she now? Why had she disappeared? The implications were too terrifying to contemplate. Back in the present, Marcos faced Sophia at the doorway of his apartment, both paralyzed by a mutual understanding forming between them. "You need to let me in," Sophia insisted, her voice trembling. "That's not a good idea," Marcos replied, mindful of Jason's body lying just a few meters away. "Marcos, you don't understand." Sophia gripped the door firmly. "I knew. I always knew." Those words hit Marcos like a physical blow. Knew what exactly? About Jason and Isabella, about their plan, and about what happened when everything went wrong. Reluctantly, Marcos allowed Sophia inside. The shock on his sister-in-law's face when she saw her brother's body was instantaneous but curiously brief, as if somehow she had already expected it. "My God, what happened here?" Sophia asked, her voice firmer than one would expect in the face of such a scene. "He confessed, Sophia, about Isabella, about how they planned to run away together. And then he said he killed her, that it was an accident, but that he killed her and hid the body." The words tumbled out in disjointed bursts. "When I confronted him, he laughed, said I'd never be able to prove anything." Sophia slowly approached her brother's body, her movements methodical, almost clinical. "Is he?" "No," Marcos replied, feeling a tear roll down his cheek. "He's unconscious. The knife, I only wanted to scare him. He came at me and—" "Listen carefully," Sophia interrupted, surprisingly calm. "We need to decide what to do now. Once he wakes up, his word against his won't be enough." "What are you suggesting?" Marcos asked, suddenly alarmed by the turn of the conversation. Sophia walked to the window, observing the silent city. Jason was always protected by our parents, by his social position, by his charm. He always believed he could get away with anything. Turning back to Marcos, she continued, "What he told you about Isabella isn't the whole truth. I found out months ago. I confronted him, and he swore it had been an accident, that she was blackmailing him. I was weak. I believed him because it was easier." "And now?" Marcos asked, feeling the ground vanish beneath his feet. "Now we have a choice," Sophia replied, her eyes fixed on Marcos. "Call the police and say you defended yourself, knowing that his family's influence will probably protect him or ensure that he never hurts anyone again." The ensuing silence was deafening. On the floor, Jason began to move slightly. He must be regaining consciousness. Time was running out, and with it, Marcos's options. 3 weeks later, Marcos was gradually resuming his routine at the hospital. The deep dark circles under his eyes revealed sleepless nights, but his colleagues attributed it to Jason's sudden disappearance. According to the official version, he had left on a business trip and never returned, an irony that did not escape Marcos given the Isabella case. The initial searches had been intense. Jason's influential family in the city had mobilized considerable resources. Sophia, with her contained pain and silent dignity, had become the family's spokesperson in press interviews. No one questioned her closeness with Marcos during that difficult period. It was natural that the two most important people in Jason's life supported each other. The apartment they had shared had been meticulously cleaned, not by Marcos or Sophia, but by discreet professionals recommended by one of Sophia's contacts at college. "It's better not to know the details," she had said while handing Marcos a new key. "Some things are better left in silence." On the 10th day after the disappearance, the police found Jason's car abandoned near the state border, a carefully planted clue that suggested a possible escape. In the passenger seat, a printed airline ticket with an international destination and a significant amount of cash. The narrative that he had abandoned his life to start anew in another country began to gain traction. That Wednesday afternoon, as Marcos was finishing his shift, he received a message from Sophia. "They found Isabella, we need to talk." Marcos's heart raced. Finding Isabella meant that the whole story could come to light, including what had happened that fateful night in his apartment. He drove mechanically to the meeting place, a discreet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Sophia was already waiting, idly flipping through a magazine. Her face was paler than usual, but she maintained that characteristic composure. "What do you mean by 'they found Isabella'?" Marcos asked as soon as he sat down, forgoing pleasantries. "Not her body," Sophia clarified in a lowered voice. "They found evidence in the construction company's warehouse. A maintenance crew found a hiding place with her belongings. Diaries, clothes, and," Sophia hesitated, "and letters addressed to Jason." "My God," Marcos murmured, feeling his stomach sink. "What did the letters say?" "They're damning. They reveal that they had been having an affair for years, long before her disappearance. And worse, they suggest that he was somehow involved." "Does the police know?" "Not yet. It was an old employee, loyal to the Mendonça family, who found them. He came to me first because you and I had been visiting the warehouse in recent weeks, doing our own searches. He thought we deserved to know." A chill ran down Marcos's spine. The visits to the warehouse had been Sophia's idea. "To better understand what happened," she had said. Now Marcos wondered if there was another motive. "What aren't you telling me, Sophia?" Sophia took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the untouched cup of coffee. "Jason wasn't just cheating on you with Isabella. They had been embezzling money from the construction company for years, millions. The plan was to fake her disappearance, wait for the dust to settle, and then he would disappear too. They would start over in some tax haven with new identities." "But something went wrong," Marcos finished, piecing it together. Sophia slowly nodded. "Isabella decided she wanted to bring someone else into the plan, her own brother. Jason refused. They argued and he killed her," Marcos concluded, feeling a growing nausea. "That's what he confessed to me that night." "Not exactly," Sophia replied, finally looking Marcos straight in the eyes. "Jason pushed her during the argument. She hit her head but didn't die immediately. He panicked and called me. The revelation struck Marcos like lightning. You were there?" "I arrived when she was still alive, Marcos. We could have called an ambulance. I wanted to do that, but Jason said we'd be implicated in the money laundering." Sophia swallowed hard, her eyes welling up for the first time. "So we waited. We waited while she..." Marcos felt the world spin. The woman before him, whom he considered a friend, an ally, had allowed someone to die, and then helped him cover up another crime. "Why are you telling me this now?" Marcos asked, his voice barely audible. "Because the evidence in the warehouse will eventually lead to Jason, and when they investigate thoroughly, they might find inconsistencies in his disappearance story. We need to be prepared." "Us? There's no us in this, Sophia." "There is. Ever since you decided not to call the police that night," Sophia replied, a new hardness in her voice. "We're in this together, Marcos, for better or for worse." It was at that moment that Marcos realized the full extent of his mistake, not just for having kept silent about Jason's fate, but for having trusted Sophia, the woman who, he now realized, was as manipulative as her brother. In the following days, the police intensified their searches at the Mendonça construction warehouse. The letters were found, as were evidence of the financial embezzlement. The local press exploded with speculation about the connection between the disappearances of Isabella and Jason. Marcos observed everything with an increasing sense of being cornered. Every new discovery seemed to bring him closer to the truth. He so feared. At night, he woke up drenched in sweat, reliving the moment the knife pierced Jason's abdomen. In the mornings, he found himself compulsively checking the news, dreading to see his name mentioned. Sophia kept in constant contact, always with updates about the investigation, always stressing the importance of keeping their stories aligned. "We're the victims here," she repeated. "Two people deceived by a manipulative man." On one particularly tense afternoon, while organizing Jason's belongings at the police's request, Marcos found a flash drive hidden in a secret compartment of the desk. Driven by the morbid curiosity that consumed him, he plugged it into his computer. The content was devastating. Conversations between Jason and Sophia, dated months earlier, revealed an even more disturbing truth. They not only knew about each other, but had actively collaborated. Sophia, the seemingly loyal and protective sister, had been involved in the financial scheme from the beginning. Even more shocking, it had been she who had suggested eliminating Isabella when she threatened to expose everything. The last exchange of messages from the night before Jason's confession sent a chill through Marcos. "Sophia, he's getting suspicious. He found the house blueprints." "Jason, what do you suggest?" "Sophia, tell a version of the truth, the one that protects us, Jason, and if he doesn't react as we expect, Sophia, then we'll have another problem to solve." The plan became painfully clear to Marcos. Jason was supposed to spin a manipulated version of events, portraying himself as a remorseful killer, but without mentioning Sophia or the embezzlement. If Marcos reacted badly, becoming a threat, another problem would need to be solved. He would be the next victim. What Sophia hadn't foreseen was that Marcos would react with immediate violence. When Jason moved to restrain him after the confession, Marcos's survival instinct took over, and then in the ensuing chaos, Sophia quickly adapted to the new situation, turning it to her advantage. With Jason out of the picture, all the embezzled money would be hers. Sitting alone in his now empty apartment, Marcos contemplated his options. The evidence against Sophia was now in his hands, but using it meant implicating himself as well. Silence, on the other hand, made him a permanent accomplice and hostage to Sophia. The cell phone rang. It was Sophia again. "We need to talk," the message said. Something unexpected came up. Marcos looked at the flash drive in his hand. Perhaps there was still a third option, one that didn't involve either silence or self-incrimination, but a way to achieve justice that he hadn't yet considered. The meeting was set for the same warehouse where it all began, a symbolic location, Marcos thought, for what would be the final chapter of this macabre story. Sophia was already waiting, nervously pacing among the piles of construction materials. Seeing Marcos, she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We need to act quickly. The police found blood in your apartment." "What kind of blood?" Marcos asked, keeping his distance. Enough to raise questions. Apparently, the cleaning wasn't as meticulous as we thought. Or perhaps, Marcos suggested calmly, it was exactly as meticulously planned as you intended it to be. Sophia frowned. "What do you mean by that?" "I found the flash drive, Sophia. I read the messages between you and Jason." The ensuing silence was as dense as fog. Sophia's expression slowly changed, the mask of concern giving way to something colder, more calculating. "I always thought you were too smart for your own good," Sophia finally said. "What do you intend to do with that information?" Initially, I thought about going to the police, but that would implicate me as well, wouldn't it? Sophia nodded cautiously. We've been in this together, Marcos. Always have been, even when you didn't know. So I thought of an alternative. Marcos continued, stepping forward. One that would free us from this entire situation. But then I realized something even more important. And what would that be? That Isabella and Jason aren't the only ones who died in this story. I died that night too. The person I was, the doctor who saved lives, the man who believed in justice. That person is gone. With a swift movement, Marcos pulled out a small recorder from his pocket. This is the only copy of our meeting today. Your confession about your involvement in Isabella's murder is recorded. I have 2 more copies in secure locations, with instructions to be handed over to the police if anything happens to me. Sophia's face paled. You wouldn't do that. You'd get arrested too. The difference between us, Sophia, is that I've been living in a prison since that night. The guilt won't let me sleep, won't let me breathe. Compared to that, her real cell seems almost like a relief. Sophia stepped toward Marcos, but stopped upon seeing something beyond him. Turning around, Marcos found 2 police officers emerging from the shadows of the shed. Marcos, Cardoso, one of them called. We need you to come with us to answer some questions about Jason Statham's disappearance. Marcos nodded calmly. I'm ready, and I believe Sophia also has a lot to explain. As he was led out of the warehouse, Marcos felt a weight slowly lifting from his shoulders. There would be consequences, he knew. Years of his life would be lost behind bars. But for the first time since that fateful night, he breathed without the crushing burden of silence. The price of truth was high, but the price of silence had become unbearable.